Hi there. Welcome back to Tuesday's Tips. I'm Greg Kaiser, and in this weekly feature we go and dive into Lightroom and really any image editor out there and talk about some of the different tools that are available. And we've been kind of going down the stack here in Lightroom for the past couple of months now. And today we're going to get into one that is not real new, but it's a little bit on the freshened up side. It used to be called split toning, and they've now replaced it with a little bit more usability, and it is called color grading. So we're going to go ahead and dive into that today, and it's another way of dealing with colors in your photograph, and it splits them up a little bit different than what we've looked at before. With the color calibration, we're looking at the mix of colors within each pixel between the red, green, and blue channels, and we can affect all the colors across the whole image that way. We've looked at hue, saturation, and luminance, and point color, which we'll deal with each color specifically, like the green tones or the red tones, not on the pixel level, but on the actual visible level. Today we're going to look at dealing with colors based on where they are on the luminosity scale, from shadows to highlights, and that's kind of the key for dealing with the color grading. So we're going to go ahead and dive in to Lightroom, and you should see my screen up right now, and I've got a couple of images here that I want to talk about. And one of them is going to be color. That one is kind of obvious, we're dealing with color. The other one is going to be black and white, and I'm going to show you why the color grading is important in black and white also. It gives you another avenue of presentation, but we'll get into that. Just as a quick review, over here on the stack, yours is probably going to look different than mine because I have ordered these in the order that I typically work them in. So we've been through the basic module, we've been through calibration, we've been through the color mixer. Tone curve was last week. I appreciate those that stuck with the entire video. It was a long one. This one should not be nearly as long. Today we're going to talk about color grading, and like I said, it used to be split toning. So if you've got an older version of Lightroom, that's probably what it's going to show up as, but they do pretty much the same thing. The new color grading just adds a little bit of functionality. So looking here at this panel, we've got the eyeball up here that toggles the effect on and off if you want to see what that one panel has done. And here beside the adjust, we've got these little icons. The first one is three dots, and it's three-way. This is how I prefer to work with color grading, and it brings everything up here at the same time. So you can deal with midtone, shadows, and highlights all at the same time and see the relationship. If you don't want to do that, or you need to do something a little bit more specific with a tone, you can go in and do each one of these. We've got the shadows, got the color wheel here, and you actually got sliders below. You've got midtones, same thing. You've got the color wheel, hue, saturation, luminance. Highlights, same thing, color wheel, hue, saturation, and luminance. How many times can I say that without getting tripped up? Below that is blending and balance, which is going to be the same between all three. And it also appears when you look at the three-way version. Now this one over here on the end that says global is just that. You no longer have the blending and balance because it is going to affect the entire picture, and whatever you do within this color wheel is going to affect everything across the board, from darks to lights to midtones. So that's what all this is up here. Now I'm going to move back to the three-way, and we've got it broken down. Midtones up here at the top, and this is the new part from when it was split toning. With split toning, it was just highlights and shadows. They've added midtones, and the way that this works out, you've got the color wheel here. This dot in the center tells you where things are going to be. So I can move this all around the color wheel, and you can see the colors changing in the picture. If I don't like where it is, I just double click. if I want to see what that one channel, what the midtones is doing, I can do the eyeball. And that's going to remove just the midtone. So if I have something else on shadows and highlights, I can just pull one of those out to see if there's a difference. Now, something that's worth mentioning, well, let's see. Here we go. Something that's worth mentioning here is this slider below. This is the luminosity slider. And if you'll recall, up in the basic panel, we have a highlights and shadows slider. And we've talked about how to do that, so go back and look at that video if you're not sure how that works. But we don't have a midtone slider. An argument can be made that the midtone slider would be the exposure because it centers around the midtones and it's not going to do nearly as much with the highlights and shadows. But here in the color grading, we can actually adjust the midtone values very easily. And it works just like the highlights and shadows and is very specific on the tones up here in the histogram where it'll apply. Same thing with the shadows. It's just down here in the shadows. So it's a little bit more of a fine tuning than shadows in the basic panel. Same thing with the highlights. We can adjust all of these luminosities. So we can really start fine-tuning an image both with the hue, the saturation, and luminance. And then once we get everything done, we can adjust the blending. And that's where these sliders come in. If we want more blending, meaning the area that is determined to be shadows, the area that's determined to be midtones, the area that's determined to be highlights, those start to blend together more. And there is more gradual or feathering between these three elements. Or we can reduce the blending back here and make those more of a hard transition. Honestly, for me, on the blending, what I like to do is just go left and right with it and see where it looks the best. You don't have to get tied up in, okay, I need more blending or less blending and try to visualize all this stuff. Just move the slider and see if one direction looks better than the other. Easy enough. Balance will change where the emphasis is. So if you had a whole bunch of stuff done with the highlights and a whole bunch done with the shadows, but you needed to change where that transition point was, have less shadows, then you could move the balance more towards the highlight end and have that effect come in more. And I'm going to show how this works, so don't worry about getting tied up. Just wanted to explain what these things do. So now we've got a good general understanding. We're going to look at this picture, and I chose this one because it's got some really nice highlights, it's got some really nice midtones, and it's got some nice shadows both in the clouds and in the sand here. So with an image like this, I'll start looking at the highlights because this is where my main color is, and I want to get that main color situated. So we can go in and we can take this center target here and we can move it around this color wheel, and you see it's all very fluid, and I can change any number of things and put it anywhere I want on this color wheel. Once I get it kind of in a place that I like, I release it, and I just had been holding it with the left mouse button and moving it around. Not that big a deal, not rocket surgery. But now at this point I want to fine tune it. Now the saturation is a little too much for me. Now I can go and click that targeted tool there in the middle there, and I can start moving it along this line. It no longer will move in the hue direction. It will only work in saturation. So I can get the saturation set to where I want it and say I want the hue changed just a little bit. So I'm going to go to this outer handle here, and now I can adjust the hue. I won't adjust the saturation, but I can change it, make it a little bit more orange, or I can come back here, make it a little bit more magenta, whatever I would like to do. So that is a real specific way of working in the color wheel. Now with the shadows, I'm going to show you a different way. I'm going to go up here to this single adjustment, and I can do the same thing, you can see that this moves the exact same way. Left click on the mouse, I can move it all around. Once I get it into an area that I want, I can change the saturation. All works the same way. But if I had something very, very specific, say I wanted to, for the effect that I was after, change the hue of the shadows to, say, 220, because this is something that I do in my own photos and it's part of my style. My shadows are always at 220. I can take the mouse and I can go left, right, I can click in there and I can key in 220. Either way, but I can get that exact value. Same thing with saturation. Say my saturation on shadows, I always like it to be 15. I just key in 15. Or I can move this however I want. So if you are going for something very, very specific, this is where this individual adjustment comes in really good. Luminance is down here. It's just one of the other sliders. So if we want to make the shadows a little bit darker, we can drop it down like that. Now what I don't like, unless I have something already in mind for values, which I don't think I ever have, one thing I don't like about doing this in the individual things is I can't see the relationship in the tones. When you look at color theory, this color wheel works, right alongside color theory. So I know I've got my highlights here, I've got my shadows here. So I'm not exactly in the complementary color area, because complementary color to this blue in the shadows would be somewhere up here in the orange. The orange would not look right with this sky. So I've got it down more in the magenta. But to get that triadic color theory going, I can do this somewhere up in the kind of yellow greens in the midtones. If I was going for, a very complementary color palette and something like that. And maybe I want to drop the midtones just a little. There we go. Sound like Bob Ross. But now we can actually see the relationship of what we've done. And it is a triadic color. We've got a point here, we've got a point up here, and we've got a point here. So our color grading has worked alongside of the triadic color theory, and it works very well visually. And you can tweak for the picture, but this just gives you an idea of why I like working with all three. Again, we can do luminosity adjustments. We can bring the highlights up a little bit. And then here's the blending. And remember, this is how that feathering goes between the shadows, midtones, and highlights. So we're either making that blending a harder line or a softer line. And the best way for me to do it anyway is just to move this slider back and forth and just see what I like. And it's very subtle at times. And of course it can also be not so subtle, but you just kind of see where you want it. And that looks pretty good to me. So I've blended the tones a little bit more. There's more of a gradual gradation between shadows, highlights, and midtones. And I'm not talking about the luminosity values. What I'm talking about is the adjustments that we have made to the hue, saturation, and potentially luminance. We've blended those together a little bit more. So it makes it a little more seamless through the whole picture. Balance, like I said, will give you more emphasis on the shadows versus the highlights. Right now it's balanced in the middle. Both shadows and highlights have the same bearing. But if we wanted to, say, bring more of that shadow effect in, the shadows are now going more into the midtones, and the midtones have been pushed more into the highlights. The highlights have been reduced as far as the change that we have made here. Now, if we wanted to bring more of this magenta-y color, we just bring the balance over to the right. And with everything in editing, it is suit to taste. Don't worry about copying down, okay, plus 68 and plus 42 is the way to go for a sunset sky at the beach. It doesn't work that way. It's very specific to the photo. So this kind of gives you an idea of how all of this works together. And remember, we have the independent eyeballs. So let's just say, I don't know if I like how the green is, but I'm not sure. Let me just hit the eyeball, and you click it, and there's not a whole lot of change. But when you click it and the line goes through the eyeball, we've removed the midtones. We bring it back. We're going to see more of a change with the highlights. So we're going to click the eyeball. Okay, we've lost all that change that we did with the highlights. Bring it back, and you see how this has changed. This is a little over the top. This is not something that I would have considered a final edit. It is too saturated for my tastes, but for the sake of doing a video, I wanted you guys to be able to see the differences. But let's say, you know, we're on to something here. We just need to do a little bit of global adjustment now, just to dial in the color changes that we've done. We can now go to the global, and in addition to having the shadow, midtone, and highlights changed, we can go in and we can change everything across the board. And we can kind of bring some more yellows in. That changes some of the highlights up in the sky more. We can come in, bring in even more magenta, or we can do something like that and bring a little bit of a cooler tone. And again, once you get that basic area set, you can bring this kind of along the different track here for saturation, and here for your hue. Now let's go and zero everything out here. I want to show you one other thing. If that is something that you're not real comfortable with doing on that level, you'll notice that there is a change between this three-way here, which I prefer to work in. But like with a lot of these color tools in Lightroom, there are training wheels. And one of the training wheels would be, let's go to the highlights just because we're going to see the most difference here. If you don't want to mess with the color wheel and you don't realize that, okay, I want more magenta in this sky for the effect that I'm going with, you can click for color presets. Now, these are not downloadable presets. This is something that's already here in Lightroom. You click that box and you get these colors. And you can see we can add a yellow. That may be what you like. It may be over the top, so you can dial it down and it's kind of more of a beige. We can cool it with a blue or a light blue. So there are a lot of different ways, and then once you get it, say this is what we wanted, but we want a little bit more orange. Again, take that handle on the outside, drag it around until it gets where you want it. Saturation needs to be adjusted. You can adjust that here, you can adjust that here. You can even go over and you can left click and drag the mouse over the number, and it kind of does the same thing. So there's a lot of different ways of doing it. It's whatever you're most comfortable with. But I did want to show that we do have color presets. It's not something that I would highly recommend because it kind of starts getting you locked into a few things. For me, I just really like going to this three-way display here and dialing in what I need. And I do try to think about color theory, and I'm either using split colors, which are, you know, just complementary colors, or I will go into a triadic color theory like I had demonstrated before. So you kind of see what all this does within a color image. And like with everything in Lightroom, play with it and see how it helps your own creative voice come across with your photos. But with color images, it's a real simple way of getting that color exactly right where you want it in a very specific way between the highlights, shadows, and midtones. But what about working a black and white image? And here's a black and white one that I want to talk about today. We've talked about converting a black and white image from color image, and there is still color detail in there. We've talked about the color profiles in the black and white. We've talked about how temperature and hue and color calibration will all affect the relationship of the tones while still keeping it black and white or grayscale. There are times, and a lot of photographers, this is their style when it comes to black and white monochrome images. They will do like a duotone. They'll do a sepia or something along those lines. This is a really good way of working those color tones into your black and white, because it's a lot of the same way as how film photographers did it back in the day. If we're dealing with like a sepia tone and we're just going for that, or maybe a cyanotype, you would go to the global wheel, which, remember, takes care of all tones from highlights to shadows. And let's say we're going for kind of a sepia look. We just kind of find where that tone is, somewhere right around in here, and then we can adjust that saturation. And maybe that's a little green, so we're going to bring a little bit more orange back in, but we can fine tune it. There we go. We can fine tune it for how we want to see it. And again, take the eyeball up here, take the whole effect away, and it lets you see your brand new sepia toned image. Now, if we don't want to do sepia and we want to do something like a cyanotype, which is just kind of largely a blue tone, we can do something like this. And again, we are adjusting everything, shadows, highlights, equally. So we can kind of just fine tune this and say something along those lines. We can even adjust the luminance. So this is almost kind of like exposure, but we can just fine tune it while we're here. And once we get kind of dialed in, we can see, okay, there's that eyeball. Let's take that off. All right, great. We see where we're at. Now that's when you're doing everything globally. But we can also go in and do a duotype, which is two different tones. And it was an early way for black and white photographers to get color pictures. And what they would do would be to tint the highlights and the shadows differently. And that's all we're going to do here. We're going to tint the highlights and the shadows. So I played around with this before I started filming, and something that I wanted to try. I wasn't sure if I would like. I actually kind of do like it, and it's backwards from what you would think. I've decided to go ahead and make the highlights cooler. So we come down to something about like this. I've got it dialed in. I'm just adjusting the saturation. So somewhere right around in there. And then the shadows, I want to do something opposite. So we are about here on the color wheel. So I want to come up here and get that opposite effect. So somewhere up in here, and just kind of season to taste, but now the shadows have a warm tone. And it kind of makes an interesting look. I liked it a whole lot more than I thought I would. But we can do the blending. So remember, we can have a harder transition, or we can have a more gradual transition. And for this, I like a harder transition usually. And we can balance it one way or the other. That's more to the shadow. That's more to the highlights. I kind of like it more zeroed in, even balance. But that's how that would work. Now, normally, go ahead and zero that out. Normally what we would see would be the shadows would be cooler, because that's how they normally appear. The highlights would be warmer. This is a more typical way of doing a duotone, and again, we're looking at these complementary colors. and we work with the blending. Again, I like a more gradual blending when it comes to this. And with the balance, we can kind of play around with it. And with this, I actually like the blue tone seeping through a little bit more. So I'm going to have it balanced more to the left, but I want to get more of that warmth. So I'm going to come up here to this handle, and I'm going to increase the saturation, just to counter the fact that there's less of it now. And there. And again, we can do the individual eyeballs, okay? That's what that highlight warmth does, or we can do the whole thing. That's what the duotone effect does. Just click on and off. This is very subtle, and it is still a monochrome image. It just has a little bit of tint to it. And if that's what you're after, this is a great way of doing that. Color grading does so much within an image and can be used in color or black and white. And it's all in what your personal voice and how your story wants to be told as far as this picture goes. It's how you use it. I use it a lot for color correcting. Occasionally I'll use it to intensify the colors in a sky for sunrise or sunset. But there are different ways that you can make this work for you. So let's see. So that pretty much tells you what color grading is all about and how it can work for you in Lightroom. I hope that you have found this beneficial. Let me know in the comments if there are any topics that you would like to see me discuss. I'm about to get done with that main stack over on the right. Just have a few more that I want to get through. And we're going to start getting into some local edits, and I still promise I'm going to do a full edit for you at some point. I just want to make sure that we've got a good groundwork before I get in, because I'll get tied up in talking about each one of the modules as I go, and the edit will take a whole lot longer than it should. I'd really like to keep it 20 minutes or so. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It does help. The channel is growing slowly. It's growing more than I thought it would. So I'm very appreciative to those of you who have helped me out by liking the videos, by subscribing to my channel. I hope I continue to bring content that is beneficial for you and that you enjoy. So until next week, happy shooting and happy editing. We'll see you again.